Single dad gave up his first-class seat for crying mum and baby. When she saw his face, his world shattered, a deeply touching love story filled with sacrifice, unexpected connection, and the kind of passion that heals hearts. Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter. Before we begin, I want to send a prayer, not just to comfort you, but to wrap your soul in light. May the Lord step gently into your life today and touch every place where you feel tired, afraid, or unseen. May He bring healing to your heart, calm to your mind, and joy that comes softly and stays deeply. May His love fill every crack this world has left behind, and may you feel chosen, held, and surrounded by grace. I pray that something beautiful finds you, even in the quietest, loneliest moments. You are not forgotten, you are cherished. Now, family. As you know, I'm not well. My voice is resting, but my heart is still here, still writing, still loving you. Today, James is reading for me, but the story you'll hear is still mine, from the same soul you've always known. And before we begin, please let me speak gently from the heart. In my stories, I've often said black woman, not as a label, but as a celebration. If my words ever felt wrong to anyone, I truly apologize. I'm not a racist. I never have been. My precious wife, Binta, is a proud black woman. Her love, strength, and beauty guide every story I write. Please know, every word comes from a place of love and deep respect. And now, I ask from my heart to yours. Please don't stop halfway. Watch the full story. Every minute matters. Not for numbers, but for us. For the love we've built here together. Like the video. Leave a kind comment. Show me you're still here. Because I feel your love, and it gives me strength to keep going. I promise I'll be back soon. Healed, strong, ready to give you even more. Now take a breath. Let your heart be still. And let James begin this story, a story written with love, from my soul to yours.
The first-class cabin of Flight 447 to Barbados hummed with quiet luxury as Douglas Gary settled into his leather seat. He adjusted his Italian suit jacket and opened his laptop, planning to review blueprints for the resort project that had brought him to the Caribbean. At 32, Douglas had built an architectural empire spanning 3 continents, his designs gracing magazine covers and winning international awards. Success had come at a steep price: endless hours, constant travel, and relationships that never quite filled the hollow ache in his chest. The boarding process continued around him, a steady stream of passengers finding their seats. Douglas barely looked up from his screen until a commotion erupted from economy class. A baby's piercing cries cut through the airplane's ambient noise, followed by frustrated murmurs from other passengers. "Can't you control that child?" someone snapped. "This is going to be a long flight," another voice complained. Douglas frowned, his concentration shattered. The crying intensified, accompanied by a woman's voice, strained and apologetic, trying to soothe the infant. Something about her tone, desperate and heartbroken, made him close his laptop and stand. "Excuse me," he said to the flight attendant bustling past. "What's happening back there?" "A passenger with a baby," she replied with barely concealed irritation. "The child won't stop crying and other passengers are complaining. We're considering moving them to a later flight." Douglas felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. Without thinking, he walked toward economy class, his tall frame moving purposefully down the narrow aisle. The scene that greeted him made his heart clench. A young black woman sat hunched in a middle seat, bouncing a screaming toddler while tears streamed down her own face. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore a simple black dress that spoke of recent grief. The passengers around her wore expressions ranging from annoyance to disgust. "Please, Zion," she whispered to the baby, her voice breaking. "Please, mi amor, just for a little while." The sound of her voice struck Douglas like lightning. That accent, melodic Caribbean warmth mixed with educated precision. that gentle Spanish murmur when upset. His world shifted as recognition flooded through him. "Libby?" The woman looked up, and Douglas felt the earth stop spinning. Libby Benson, the love of his college years. The woman he'd left behind 8 years ago when ambition and family pressure convinced him he was too young for forever. Her face was thinner now, marked by grief and exhaustion, but those warm brown eyes were exactly as he remembered, except now they were filled with shock and disbelief. "Douglas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her son's cries. For a moment, neither could speak. Time collapsed. They were 21 again, studying in the university library, making plans they'd been too young to keep. 11 years vanished in an instant. Douglas saw every emotion cross her face: surprise, pain, confusion, and something deeper he couldn't identify. The baby's cries brought him back to the present. Without hesitation, Douglas knelt beside her seat, his voice gentle. "Hey there, little man." Something miraculous happened. Zion's cries immediately quieted to hiccups, his dark eyes, so much like his mother's, focusing on this stranger with curious intensity. Tiny hands reached toward Douglas, and when their fingers touched, the baby smiled through his tears. "He likes you," Libby said softly, wonder in her voice. "He doesn't usually with strangers." Douglas felt something crack open in his chest as he looked at this beautiful child, Libby's son. "What's his name?" "Zion," she replied, unconsciously leaning closer as her baby reached for Douglas again. "He's 18 months old." The weight of those words settled between them. 18 months ago, Libby had been married to someone else, building a life that didn't include him. The knowledge was a sharp reminder of all the time that had passed, all the choices that had led them to this moment. "I'm so sorry for the disturbance," Libby said to the nearby passengers, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "He's usually such a good baby, but the flight delay and everything." "No disturbance at all," Douglas said firmly, his voice carrying an authority that made the complaining passengers settle back into their seats. He turned to the flight attendant who had appeared beside them. "I'd like to switch seats with this lady," he said to the flight attendant. The attendant blinked in surprise. "Sir, you're in first class. There would be a significant fare difference." "I'll cover any additional costs," Douglas interrupted, his eyes never leaving Libby's face. "Please arrange the switch immediately." "Douglas, you don't have to," Libby began. "Yes, I do," he said quietly, and something in his tone silenced her protests. 20 minutes and some creative ticket adjustments later, they were settled in first class. Libby sat stiffly in the luxurious seat, clearly uncomfortable with the upgrade, while Douglas watched her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. "You look tired," he said gently. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's what grief does to you. That and single motherhood." The words hung in the air between them. Single motherhood. So her husband was gone. Douglas felt a complex mix of emotions: sorrow for her loss, guilt for the relief that followed, and an overwhelming desire to ease her pain. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for your loss." Libby nodded, her throat working as she swallowed back tears. Sebastian he was a good man, a wonderful father to Zion. She looked at her son, who was now drowsily leaning against her shoulder. "Cancer took him 8 months ago. We came back to Barbados 6 months ago when I couldn't bear Trinidad anymore." The raw pain in her voice made Douglas want to reach for her, to offer comfort the way he used to when they were together. Instead, he clenched his hands in his lap. "How are you managing?" "One day at a time," she replied, unconsciously echoing the words she'd learned in grief counseling. "We're going home to Barbados. I couldn't stay in Trinidad anymore. Too many memories." Douglas studied her profile as she gazed out the window. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, but there was a fragility to her now that hadn't been there in college. Life had marked her, Loss, responsibility, heartbreak, but it had also deepened her beauty, adding layers of strength and grace that took his breath away. "What about you?" she asked, finally meeting his eyes. "What brings the famous Douglas Gary to Barbados?" He was surprised she knew about his success, then remembered she'd always followed architecture, had dreamed of designing sustainable housing for Caribbean communities. "You know about my work?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Your buildings are in all the magazines. The Gary signature is hard to miss." Her expression grew serious. "You achieved everything you wanted." The unspoken words hung between them. "Everything you left me for." "Did I?" he asked quietly, and for a moment his carefully constructed facade slipped, revealing the loneliness he'd carried for 8 years. Before she could respond, Zion stirred against her shoulder, his little hand reaching toward Douglas again. This time, she didn't pull away when Douglas gently took the small fingers in his own. "He has your eyes," Douglas said, marveling at the trust in the child's gaze. "But his father's stubborn streak," Libby replied, and Douglas heard the love and loss intertwined in her voice. As the plane soared over the Atlantic toward Barbados, Douglas found himself making a decision that would change everything. He was supposed to fly back to New York in 3 days after finalizing the resort contracts. But looking at Libby, this woman who had never really left his heart, and the beautiful child who seemed determined to trust him, Douglas knew he wouldn't be leaving that quickly. Some reunions were coincidence, others were destiny calling you home. Chapter 2. What We Left Behind. As the plane hummed through the night sky, Libby stole glances at the man beside her, hardly believing this was real. Douglas Gary, the boy who had owned her heart, the man who had shattered it, sat inches away, his strong hands gentle as he helped Zion play with a toy airplane. The years had been kind to him. Boyish features had matured into rugged handsomeness, his frame filled out with the confidence of success. But those eyes, deep green eyes that had once gazed at her like she was his entire world, remained exactly the same. 11 years earlier, Douglas had been 21 then, a senior architecture student with dreams as vast as his smile. Libby was pursuing nursing, driven to help her community and make her immigrant grandmother proud. They'd met during finals week in the university library, both exhausted and surviving on coffee and determination. "You're in my spot," Douglas had said, sliding into the chair across from her at what she'd claimed as her table. "Your spot?" Libby had looked up from her anatomy textbook, eyebrow raised. "I don't see your name on it." "Look closer," he'd grinned, pointing to barely visible scratches in the wood. "DG plus. Well, I was waiting to fill in the rest." She'd laughed despite herself, charmed by his easy confidence and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. "You're terribly presumptuous." "I prefer optimistic," he'd countered, pulling out his own books. Douglas Gary, future architect of beautiful buildings and terrible pickup lines. Libby Benson, future nurse and critic of said terrible pickup lines. They'd studied together that night, and the next, and the one after that. What started as academic companionship quickly bloomed into something magical. Douglas would bring her coffee, perfectly prepared with the amount of cream she liked, and she would share her grandmother's homemade empanadas that Abuela Esperanza sent in care packages. Their first kiss happened during spring break of their junior year, on the roof of the architecture building where Douglas had brought her to see his latest project model. The sun was setting, painting the campus in golden light, and he'd been explaining his vision for sustainable community housing when she'd simply reached up and kissed him, tired of waiting for him to make the first move. "I was building up to that," he'd murmured against her lips. "You architects take too long with your plans," she'd whispered back, making him laugh before he kissed her again, deeper this time, with all the passion they'd both been holding back. They were inseparable after that. Douglas would walk her to her nursing clinicals, bringing her lunch during her long shifts. She would sit in the studio while he worked on his designs, her presence somehow making his creativity flow even stronger. They talked about everything, their families, their dreams, their fears. Douglas shared his vision of designing affordable housing that didn't sacrifice beauty for function. Libby spoke of opening a clinic in the Caribbean where quality healthcare would be accessible to everyone. "We could do it together," Douglas had said one night as they lay tangled in his narrow dorm bed, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "You could run the medical side, I could design the buildings. We could change the world." "Together," she'd agreed, pressing a kiss to his heartbeat. They'd made so many plans that final year. Douglas proposed the night before graduation with a simple gold band, all he could afford on his student budget, promising to replace it with something worthy of her when he made his fortune. She'd said yes through happy tears, believing in their forever. But forever had proved more fragile than either of them imagined. Douglas's mother, Vivienne Gary, had other plans for her son. A sophisticated woman from old New England money, she tolerated her son's college romance as a phase. But when Douglas announced his engagement to that Caribbean girl, Vivienne's polite mask had slipped. "You're throwing your life away," she'd said during the tense dinner where Douglas brought Libby to meet his parents. "You're 21 years old, Douglas. You haven't lived. You haven't seen the world. Marriage now will only hold you back." "Libby doesn't hold me back," Douglas had protested. "She inspires me." "Inspiration is lovely for poetry," his father had interjected. "But you have responsibilities. The Gary name means something in this industry. You can't build a serious architectural career while playing house with your college girlfriend." The pressure had been relentless, phone calls filled with subtle manipulations about wasted potential and closed doors. Stories of other young men who'd married too early and watched their dreams crumble. Job offers that came with implicit or explicit expectations about his personal life. The final blow came when Stefan Lange, a legendary architect, offered Douglas a position at his prestigious firm, but only if he was free to travel extensively and focus entirely on his career for the next 5 years. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime," Vivienne had pressed during another strained phone call. "Do you really want to give up everything you've worked for? And what about Libby? Don't you think she deserves someone who can give her stability, not a struggling architect who'll be traveling constantly?" Doubt had crept in slowly, poisonously. Douglas began to wonder if he was being selfish, asking Libby to build her life around his uncertain career. She was brilliant, compassionate, deserving of security and happiness. What if his love wasn't enough? What if his family was right and he was too young, too naive, too unprepared for the weight of forever? The breakup happened 3 weeks before their planned wedding. Douglas had stood in her small apartment, still wearing the engagement ring she'd been so proud of, and shattered both their worlds with words that felt like lies, even as he spoke them. "I'm not ready," he'd said, unable to meet her eyes. "We're too young. I need to focus on my career, and you deserve someone who can give you everything you want." "I want you," she'd whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I only want you." "That's not enough," he'd forced himself to say, each word cutting him as deeply as it cut her. "I'm sorry, Libby. I'm so sorry." She'd given him back the ring without a word, her silence more devastating than any angry response could have been. Douglas had taken the job with Stefan Lang, throwing himself into work with desperate intensity. He'd traveled the world, designed magnificent buildings, built the empire his family had wanted for him. But success felt hollow without her to share it with. Libby had disappeared from his life completely. Mutual friends reported that she'd finished nursing school and moved back to Barbados. But Douglas had forced himself not to pursue details. He'd made his choice. He had to live with it. What he hadn't known was that she'd met Sebastian Morales 2 years later at a medical conference in Trinidad. Sebastian was a gentle man, 5 years older than Libby, who worked as a pediatric specialist and volunteered his time in underserved communities. He'd seen the sadness she carried and had, patiently, tenderly, helped her heal. Their courtship was quiet and sweet. Sebastian never tried to replace what she'd lost. Instead, he offered her a different kind of love, steady, reliable, devoted. When he proposed, Libby said yes, not with the desperate passion she'd felt for Douglas, but with gratitude for the peace he brought to her wounded heart. They'd been happy, different from the wild, intense love she'd shared with Douglas, but genuinely happy. Sebastian adored her, supported her dreams of expanding healthcare access in the Caribbean, and when they struggled with infertility, he suggested adoption with such immediate enthusiasm that she fell in love with him all over again. Zion had come to them as a 3-month-old baby, his young mother unable to care for him. The moment Libby held him, she knew he was meant to be theirs. Sebastian had been a devoted father, patient and loving, teaching Zion Spanish lullabies and taking him to the beach every morning to watch the sunrise. Cancer had stolen him just as cruelly as it stole everything else precious in the world. 6 months of watching the man she'd learned to love waste away while trying to care for a toddler and maintain her composure had nearly broken her. Now, on this plane, Libby watched Douglas interact so naturally with her son and felt the old wounds reopening alongside something that felt dangerously like hope. Chapter 3. Island Welcome. The Grantley Adams International Airport buzzed with familiar energy, vacation excitement mixed with the warm efficiency of island life. As they deplaned, Libby felt humid Caribbean air wrap around her like a long-awaited embrace. This was home, where ocean breezes carried the scent of frangipani and salt, where every sunrise painted the world in watercolor hues. Zion stirred in her arms, his dark eyes wide as he took in the colorful surroundings. He'd been an angel during the rest of the flight, seeming to sense that the stranger beside them was somehow special. Douglas had entertained him with simple games and gentle stories, his natural ease with children both surprising and heart-tugging. "I can't believe you gave up your first-class seat," Libby said again as they walked through the terminal. She'd been repeating variations of this gratitude throughout the flight, still overwhelmed by his kindness. "Stop thanking me," Douglas replied, effortlessly carrying both her suitcase and his own travel bag. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said quietly, watching how other passengers moved around them without offering help to a woman struggling with luggage and a baby. "They wouldn't have." Douglas paused in the middle of the terminal, turning to face her fully. "Libby, you don't need to thank me for basic human decency. You never did." The weight of his words and the memories they carried hung between them. In college, Douglas had always been the one to carry her books, to bring her coffee during all-night study sessions, to walk her safely across campus after evening classes. His thoughtfulness had never been performative. It had simply been who he was. "Mommy? Mommy's home!" The excited shout cut through the terminal noise, and Libby turned to see her cousin Elena rushing toward them with her arms outstretched. Elena worked at the airport's tourism office and had insisted on meeting Libby's flight, despite having 3 young children of her own at home and a husband who worked double shifts at the port. She'd been Libby's closest confidant through both the joy of marriage and the agony of widowhood. "Elena?" Libby's face brightened with the first genuine smile Douglas had seen since their reunion. The cousins embraced, Elena immediately reaching for Zion, who went willingly to her. "Look how this little man grow big," Elena exclaimed in her natural Bajan cadence. "You eating good in Trinidad, sweetheart?" She turned to Douglas with frank curiosity. "So you the famous architect, eh? Elena tell me you designed some real nice buildings." Douglas smiled at the directness. I try to design buildings that serve the community. That's good talk, Elena nodded approvingly. We get plenty architects come here wanting to build big fancy resorts, push out the local people. You different? Libby's cheeks flushed. Elena, this is Douglas Gary. Douglas, my cousin Elena, my sister in every way that matters. Elena's eyes widened with recognition, and Douglas saw her make the connection. This was the Douglas, the one from the old stories and heartbreak. Her expression shifted through surprise, protectiveness, and finally guarded suspicion. Douglas Gary, she repeated, her tone carefully controlled. What a coincidence. But he's helped us so much already, Libby added quickly, sensing the tension. He gave up his first-class seat when Zion was having a difficult time. Elena's expression softened only slightly. Well then, you're welcome in Barbados, Mr. Gary. For now. The drive to Libby's childhood home took them through the heart of the island, past sugarcane fields swaying in the afternoon breeze, and small villages where children played cricket in dusty lots. They passed rum shops with men playing dominoes under trees, and roadside vendors selling flying fish sandwiches and snow cones. Douglas found himself enchanted by the landscape and the easy rhythm of Bajan life. Libby's house sat on a small hill overlooking the sea, a traditional Bajan chattel house painted in soft yellow with white trim. It was modest but charming, with a wraparound veranda and a garden bursting with hibiscus, bougainvillea, and breadfruit trees. However, Douglas's trained eye immediately noticed the sagging roof, the peeling paint, and the front steps that listed dangerously to one side. Abuela, Libby called out as they approached the house. We're home. The front door burst open, and a small elderly woman emerged like a hurricane of energy and joy. Esperanza Delgado was 78 years old, but moved with the vigor of someone half her age. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elaborate bun, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept over the small group approaching her home. Mi niña, she cried, pulling Libby into a fierce embrace before turning to Zion. And my beautiful boy, come to Bisabuela. Zion giggled as his great-grandmother covered his face with kisses, his little hands tangling in her hair. But Abuela Esperanza's attention quickly shifted to Douglas, and he felt himself being evaluated with the intensity of a laser beam. And you, she said in accented English, her voice carrying decades of wisdom and considerable wariness, you are Douglas. It wasn't a question. Douglas felt himself being evaluated with the intensity of a laser beam. Yes, ma'am. It's a pleasure to meet you. Is it now? Abuela Esperanza circled him slowly, like a general inspecting enemy troops. You look older, softer around the edges maybe, but I remember what you did to my granddaughter. Abuela, Libby protested, embarrassed. What? I'm just observing. 8 years will age a person. She stopped directly in front of Douglas, barely reaching his chest but somehow managing to look down on him anyway. You broke my granddaughter's heart. The words hit like a physical blow. Douglas met her gaze steadily, knowing he deserved her judgment. Yes, ma'am, I did. Good. At least you don't lie about it. She studied him for another long moment. What are you doing here? I'm helping with their luggage, Douglas said carefully. Are you now? Abuela Esperanza's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. Well then, help them inside, but wipe your feet first. The interior of the house was as charming as the exterior, filled with handmade furniture and family photographs spanning generations. But Douglas also noticed the water stains on the ceiling, the windows that didn't quite close properly, and the electrical outlets that sparked when Elena plugged in a fan. Libby, why don't you get Zion settled while I prepare some tea? Abuela Esperanza suggested, though her tone made it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. Mr. Gary, you'll join us, won't you? Douglas started to decline politely. He had a hotel reservation and business calls to make, but something in the elderly woman's expression stopped him. "I'd be honored." 20 minutes later, they sat on the back veranda overlooking the garden and the sea beyond. Zion played contentedly on a blanket spread on the floor, surrounded by wooden toys that had obviously seen multiple generations of children. Abuela Esperanza served tea in delicate china cups that seemed too fragile for the island heat, along with coconut bread that melted in Douglas's mouth. "This house belonged to my husband's family," Abuela Esperanza explained, noticing Douglas's interested examination of the architecture. "Built in 1943, moved here from Bridgetown in 1962 when they expanded the port." "Moved?" Douglas asked, fascinated despite himself. "Chattel houses were designed to be portable," Libby explained, settling beside Zion on the blanket. "When people rented land, they needed to be able to take their homes with them if necessary." Douglas nodded, mentally cataloging the ingenious construction methods that allowed for such mobility. But his architect's eye also noticed the structural issues that decades of storms and island humidity had created. "The roof needs attention," he said without thinking, then immediately looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Oh, you noticed that too," Abuela Esperanza said dryly. "Also the front steps, the back door that sticks, and the bathroom faucet that only gives hot water if you sweet-talk it just right." Libby's cheeks burned with shame. "Abuela, you don't need to." "What?" "Tell the truth. This house has been good to us for 60 years, but houses need care, and care costs money." She fixed Douglas with that penetrating stare again. "I suppose you stay in fancy hotels when you travel for business." "Usually," Douglas admitted. "How long are you in Barbados?" 3 days originally, but Douglas found himself making a decision he hadn't planned. "I think I might extend my stay. There's more to see here than I expected." As if sensing the shift in conversation, Zion crawled over to Douglas and pulled himself up on his legs, babbling happily. Without hesitation, Douglas lifted the toddler into his lap, earning a delighted laugh and a round of applause from the little boy. "He likes you," Libby observed softly. "Children see things clearly," Abuela Esperanza said meaningfully. "They recognize good hearts." Douglas felt something loosening in his chest as he held Zion, watching the boy's fascination with his watch. This, sitting on a veranda overlooking the Caribbean Sea, drinking tea with 3 generations of a family that felt more like home than any place he'd lived in years, this felt right in a way that his Manhattan penthouse never had. "You know," he said slowly, "I do have some experience with historical renovation. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to take a look at what needs to be done here." Abuela Esperanza and Libby exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. "We couldn't afford to pay," Libby began. "Who said anything about payment?" Douglas interrupted gently. "Sometimes a person just wants to help." As the sun set over the Caribbean, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Douglas found himself exactly where he'd never known he wanted to be. Chapter 4. Rebuilding Trust. 3 days stretched into a week, and Douglas settled into a rhythm he'd never experienced. Each morning he arrived at Libby's house as the sun painted the sky in soft pastels, carrying coffee from the local cafe and pastries from the bakery down the hill. He'd moved from his sterile hotel to a nearby guest house, claiming he wanted to better understand local architecture, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't bear to leave. "You don't have to keep bringing breakfast," Libby protested on Thursday morning, though she accepted the coffee gratefully. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. Zion had been restless the night before, and she'd spent hours walking the floors with him. "I want to," Douglas replied simply, settling onto the front steps where he'd been working to level the foundation. He'd moved from his sterile hotel to Mrs. Patterson's guest house down the hill, a small, clean room with a kitchenette and a view of the sea. The elderly widow had been delighted to have a long-term guest and had already begun mothering him with home-cooked meals and island gossip. Besides, I eat breakfast anyway, might as well eat it somewhere with a view. The view he was referring to wasn't just the ocean, and they both knew it. He watched her move around the veranda in the early morning light, her hair loose around her shoulders, humming softly as she prepared Zion's breakfast. She wore simple clothes, a cotton sundress and sandals, but she was more beautiful than any woman in designer gowns he'd escorted to gallery openings in New York. "Mama!" Zion called from inside, and Libby disappeared to tend to him. Moments later, she emerged with the toddler on her hip, his face sticky with mango juice and his smile bright enough to power the entire island. "Dougie!" Zion squealed, reaching his arms toward Douglas. The nickname had emerged naturally over the past few days, and each time Zion said it, Douglas felt something in his chest grow warmer. He set down his tools and accepted the enthusiastic hug, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and tropical fruit. "How's my favorite architect this morning?" Douglas asked seriously, as if consulting with a colleague. Zion babbled a response that sounded remarkably professional, pointing toward the tools and the partially repaired steps. "He says the foundation needs more work on the eastern corner," Libby translated with a straight face. "Smart kid. I was thinking the same thing." Douglas lifted Zion higher, spinning him in a gentle circle that earned delighted giggles. "Should we check the roof situation next?" "Absolutely not," Libby said firmly. "You're not climbing on my roof." "Our roof," Abuela Esperanza corrected from the doorway, appearing with her own cup of coffee and a knowing look. "And he's perfectly capable of climbing on roofs, Nina. He built those tall buildings, didn't he?" Douglas had spent considerable time with Abuela Esperanza over the past week, and he'd discovered beneath her protective exterior a sharp mind and wicked sense of humor. She'd also been remarkably forthcoming about Libby's struggles since Sebastian's death. "She works too hard at that clinic," Abuela Esperanza had confided the day before, while they worked together in the garden, ostensibly out of Libby's hearing. 12-hour shifts, sometimes 14 when they're short-staffed. Then she comes home and tries to take care of everything else, too. Douglas had watched Libby through the kitchen window as her grandmother spoke, noting the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she moved with mechanical efficiency, even when she thought no one was looking. What about help? Family support. Elena does what she can, but she has her own family. Sebastian's parents. They mean well, but they live in Trinidad. Abuela Esperanza had stopped weeding and fixed Douglas with a penetrating stare. "Which brings me to you, young man. My granddaughter has been hurt enough for one lifetime. If you're here to play games or ease your conscience about what happened before, you best leave now before that boy gets more attached." The knowledge had settled in Douglas's chest like a weight. Libby was carrying so much, had been carrying it alone for months. The fierce independence that had attracted him in college had become a wall built from necessity and loss. Now, watching her try to balance Zion and her nursing bag while rushing to get ready for another long shift at the clinic, Douglas made a decision. "I'll watch Zion today," he said casually. Libby froze in the middle of gathering her things. "What?" "You said the regular babysitter is sick, and Abuela Esperanza has her church meeting. I'll watch Zion." "Douglas, you don't know anything about taking care of a toddler." "I'm a fast learner. Besides, how hard can it be? We'll work on the house repairs together. He can be my assistant." Abuela Esperanza clapped her hands together. "Excellent idea. The boy needs more male influence in his life anyway." "Abuela?" Libby looked scandalized. "What?" "It's true. Sebastian was wonderful. May he rest in peace, but Zion barely remembers him." This one, she gestured toward Douglas. He's patient, he's gentle, and Zion adores him. What's the problem? The problem, Libby thought, was that watching Douglas with her son was awakening feelings she'd buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself they were gone. The problem was that Zion had started looking for Douglas every morning, his face lighting up when he heard the familiar voice. The problem was that she was starting to depend on this kindness, and dependence terrified her. But she was also desperately tired, and the clinic was understaffed, and Zion did seem happier than he'd been since Sebastian's death. "Are you sure?" she asked Douglas, her voice small. "Completely sure. We'll have a great time, won't we, buddy?" Zion clapped his hands enthusiastically, as if sealing the deal. The day proved to be a revelation for Douglas. Caring for Zion required a different kind of attention than designing buildings, more immediate, more responsive, more rewarding in ways he hadn't expected. They spent the morning working on the front steps, with Zion helping by handing Douglas wooden blocks that served as pretend tools. Lunch was an adventure in itself. Douglas had never realized how much food could end up on floors, walls, and every surface within a 3-foot radius of a toddler. But Zion's delighted laughter when Douglas made airplane noises while delivering spoonfuls of rice and beans made the cleanup worthwhile. The afternoon brought a thunderstorm, trapping them inside where they built elaborate block towers for Zion to knock down with gleeful abandon. Douglas found himself on the floor, seeing the world from a toddler's perspective, marveling at how everything could be fascinating when viewed through 18-month-old eyes. "You're a natural," Abuela Esperanza observed when she returned from her church meeting to find Douglas and Zion napping together on the sofa. The baby curled trustingly against the man's chest. When Libby returned from her shift that evening, exhausted and expecting chaos, she found a clean house, a fed and bathed baby, and Douglas reading softly from a picture book while Zion dozed in his lap. "How was your day?" she asked, settling onto the veranda steps beside them. "Perfect," Douglas replied, and meant it completely. They developed a routine over the following days. Douglas would help with morning repairs while Libby got ready for work, then spend the day with Zion, teaching him new words and letting him help with various projects around the house. Evenings were spent together on the veranda, watching the sunset paint the sky while Zion played at their feet. It was during one of these evening sessions that Libby finally opened up about her financial struggles. "I know you've noticed the bills on the kitchen counter," she said quietly, Zion sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Sebastian's medical treatments. Insurance didn't cover everything, and the clinic pays well for the island, but not enough for a single mother supporting 3 generations," Douglas finished gently. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm managing. We're managing, but some months are harder than others." Douglas wanted to offer help immediately, to write a check that would solve all her problems, but he sensed that direct financial assistance would wound her pride. Instead, he said, "You know, I've been thinking about expanding my business to include Caribbean projects, sustainable architecture suited to tropical climates. I'd need a local consultant, someone who understands the community's needs." Libby looked up sharply. "Douglas, it would be legitimate work, good pay, and you understand healthcare infrastructure better than anyone I know." Before she could respond, Zion stirred in her arms, murmuring, "Dougie," in his sleep. "He's getting attached," she said softly. "So am I," Douglas admitted. The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. They were sitting closer than they had since college, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, close enough to count the faint lines that years of success and loneliness had etched around them. "Libby," he said quietly, and she knew he was going to say something that would change everything. But Zion chose that moment to wake up fully, crying for milk and comfort, and the spell was broken. As she rose to tend to her son, Libby wondered if she was grateful for the interruption or devastated by it. Later that night, after Zion was settled and Abuela Esperanza had retired, they found themselves walking on the beach behind the house. The moon was full, casting silver paths across the water, and the trade winds carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine. "I used to walk this beach when I was upset," Libby said, her bare feet sinking into the cool sand. "After you left, I'd come here and try to understand what I'd done wrong." Douglas stopped walking. "You didn't do anything wrong? Then why did you leave?" The question hung in the salt air between them. Douglas had rehearsed explanations for 8 years, but standing here with her under the Caribbean stars, all his carefully constructed justifications seemed inadequate. "Because I was 21 and terrified," he said finally. "Because my family convinced me I was ruining both our lives by wanting forever so young. Because I thought I was being noble, setting you free to find someone better." "Someone better?" Libby's voice was incredulous. "Douglas, you were everything to me." "Past tense," he noted quietly. She turned to face him, the moonlight turning her skin luminous. "Some things don't change." They were standing too close now, the space between them electric with possibility and 8 years of unresolved longing. Douglas reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Libby," he whispered. She rose on her tiptoes, her lips almost touching his, and for a moment the years disappeared, and they were 21 again, believing in forever. But at the last second she pulled back, her eyes wide with something that might have been panic. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm not ready. I'm not sure I'll ever be ready." Douglas let his hand fall to his side, the rejection stinging but understanding flooding through him. "I know. I'm sorry." They walked back to the house in silence, both knowing something fundamental had shifted between them, neither sure what came next. Chapter 5. Falling again. The weather forecast had called for rain, but tropical weather was unpredictable. What started as typical tropical showers quickly intensified, with winds bending palm trees nearly horizontal and rain falling in sheets so thick it turned the world gray. Douglas had planned to spend the morning at his hotel, catching up on calls with his New York office and reviewing contracts for the resort project. But when the power went out across half the island, he found himself driving through the worsening storm to Libby's house, worried about the old electrical system and the roof repairs that weren't quite finished. He arrived to find Libby securing the shutters, while Zion watched from inside, his little face pressed against the window. The wind whipped her hair around her face as she struggled with the heavy wooden panels, and Douglas jumped out of his rental car to help. "You shouldn't have driven in this," she shouted over the wind, but her relief was obvious. "Good thing I did," he called back, taking the shutter from her hands and securing it properly. "These latches needed adjusting anyway." Together they worked their way around the house, battening down against the storm. By the time they finished, they were both soaked through, and the wind had picked up to the point where standing outside was dangerous. "The power's been out for an hour," Libby said as they rushed inside, water dripping from their clothes onto the hardwood floor. "I was starting to worry about the roof over Zion's room." As if summoned by his name, Zion toddled over to Douglas, arms outstretched for comfort. The little boy had been clingy all morning, sensing the change in atmospheric pressure and his mother's tension. "Hey, buddy," Douglas said, lifting him up. "Pretty loud out there, isn't it?" Zion nodded solemnly, then brightened when lightning illuminated the house in stark white. "Big," he announced proudly, clapping his hands. "Very big noise," Douglas agreed, settling onto the sofa with the toddler while Libby disappeared to find towels and dry clothes. Abuela Esperanza emerged from her bedroom wearing a thick robe and carrying an armful of candles. "This one's going to be here for a while," she said, gesturing toward the windows where rain drummed against the shutters. "Good thing you're here, Douglas." These old houses can be frightening in storms when you're alone. The power flickered back on briefly, then died completely, plunging them into the gray half-light of the storm. Libby returned with towels and a dry shirt for Douglas, her own hair braided back, and her clothes changed to comfortable cotton pajamas despite it being midday. "I called the clinic," she said, lighting candles around the living room. "They're closed until the storm passes. Half the staff couldn't get there anyway." It felt strange and intimate, being trapped together in the candlelit house while the storm raged outside. Without electricity, the usual distractions disappeared. No television, no radio, no laptop to hide behind. There was nothing to do but exist together in the flickering light, listening to the wind and rain create a cocoon around them. "Story," Zion demanded, climbing from Douglas's lap to retrieve his favorite picture book from the toy basket. For the next hour, they took turns reading to him, their voices mixing in the cozy space while thunder rumbled overhead. Douglas found himself watching Libby as she acted out different character voices, her face animated and lovely in the candlelight. When she caught him staring, she blushed but didn't look away. "What?" she asked softly. "You're beautiful," he said simply, the dim light and forced intimacy making honesty easier. Her breath caught, and for a moment the storm outside seemed secondary to the electricity crackling between them. "Douglas," she began, but Zion chose that moment to announce he was hungry, breaking the spell. Lunch became an adventure. With no power for the electric stove, Libby pulled out a camping burner she'd inherited from Sebastian, and they worked together to prepare a simple meal of sandwiches and fruit. Zion insisted on helping, which mostly involved dropping pieces of mango on the floor and clapping when the thunder rumbled particularly loudly. "He's not afraid at all," Douglas observed, watching the toddler dance to the rhythm of the rain. "Sebastian used to take him out on the veranda during storms when he was tiny," Libby explained, a wistful smile crossing her face. "He said children should learn to appreciate nature's power, not fear it, though he was often too tired from his treatments to follow through on promises like that toward the end. He sounds like he was a good father." Libby nodded, stirring sugar into her coffee. "He was a good man. Patient, kind, gentle. He would have loved seeing you with Zion like this." The comment surprised Douglas. Would he? Sebastian never felt threatened by the past. He used to say that love wasn't a finite resource, that me having loved you didn't mean I loved him less. She paused, her voice growing softer. "He said he hoped someday I'd forgive you, because carrying anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick." The wisdom of a man Douglas had never met, but was growing to respect, settled between them. "He was wiser than I was." "Different," Libby corrected. "You were 21. Sebastian was 27 when we married, and he'd already made his share of mistakes. Time teaches patience." As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified. What had started as heavy rain became a deluge, and the winds increased to the point where they could hear debris hitting the house. When a particularly strong gust rattled the shutters, Abuela Esperanza emerged from her room, carrying blankets and pillows. "We're sleeping in the main room tonight," she announced, "away from the big trees in case they fall." They arranged a makeshift campsite in the living room, with Zion's portable crib set up in the safest corner and mattresses dragged from the bedrooms. It felt like an adventure to the toddler, who giggled as they built a fort of pillows and blankets around his sleeping area. "Sleepover," he announced happily, clapping his hands. As darkness fell, the storm seemed to settle in for the long haul. They ate dinner by candlelight, canned soup heated on the camping burner, crackers and fruit that would spoil without refrigeration. It was simple fare, but the atmosphere made it feel special, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with family. After dinner, while Abuela Esperanza told Zion stories about her childhood in Barbados, Douglas and Libby found themselves washing dishes together in the kitchen, working by the light of a single candle. "This feels familiar," Libby said quietly, handing him a plate to dry. "Late-night study sessions in your dorm kitchen," Douglas remembered. "You'd make tea, I'd wash your coffee mugs. You complained constantly about how many mugs I went through in a day." "I never complained. I pointed out the environmental impact." "Same thing." She smiled, bumping his shoulder with hers in a gesture so familiar it made his heart ache. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the storm providing background music to their domestic dance. When their hands touched in the soapy water, neither pulled away immediately. "Libby," Douglas said quietly. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." They were standing closer now, the small kitchen forcing proximity that felt both accidental and inevitable. Douglas set down the dish towel and turned to face her fully, his hands finding her waist. "I've missed you," he said simply. "Every day for 8 years, I've missed you." Douglas. But this time his name wasn't a protest, it was a prayer. When he leaned down to kiss her, she rose to meet him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, tentative, relearning each other after so much time apart. But familiarity rushed back like muscle memory, and the kiss deepened. 8 years of longing and regret and love pouring between them. Libby's hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, and Douglas lost himself in the taste of her, the scent of her shampoo, the soft sound she made against his mouth. It was everything he remembered and more, the way she melted against him, the way her breath hitched when he traced her lower lip with his tongue, the way she whispered his name like a benediction. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Douglas rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he whispered. "I never stopped." For a moment, Libby's face was radiant, her eyes bright with tears and hope. But then reality crashed back, and Douglas watched her barriers slam into place. "No," she said, stepping back so quickly she nearly knocked over the candle. "No, we can't do this." "Libby, you left me." The words burst out of her, months of grief and years of suppressed pain finally finding voice. "You left me when I needed you most, when we were supposed to build a life together. You chose your career over us, and now you think you can just come back and pick up where we left off." "That's not what I think, isn't it?" Her voice broke. "I rebuilt my life, Douglas. I found love again. I had a family. I was happy. And then Sebastian died, and I'm just starting to figure out how to be okay again, and you appear and make me feel—" "Make you feel what?" She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking very young and very afraid. "Like I'm 21 again. Like I'm willing to risk everything for a love that might disappear the moment things get difficult." The hurt in her voice cut him deeper than any anger could have. "I'm not going anywhere, Libby." "You don't know that. You can't promise that." From the living room, they heard Zion calling for his mother, and Libby seized the excuse to escape, leaving Douglas alone in the kitchen with the storm raging both outside and in his heart. Chapter 6: Family Expectations. The morning after the storm dawned crystal clear, as if the island was showing off after the previous night's drama. Palm fronds and debris littered the yard, but the house had weathered everything beautifully, thanks largely to Douglas's recent repairs. He was clearing fallen branches when the first car pulled into the driveway. Douglas straightened, recognizing the sleek rental sedan and the perfectly coiffed woman stepping out of it. Vivienne Gary looked exactly as he remembered, elegant, composed, and completely out of place on the rustic Caribbean property. Her designer heels clicked disapprovingly on the uneven walkway as she surveyed the modest house with barely concealed dismay. "Mother," Douglas said, setting down the branch he'd been dragging, "this is unexpected. Is it?" Vivian air-kissed his cheek, careful not to actually touch him. "You've been here for 2 weeks, Douglas. 2 weeks without returning my calls or attending the Morrison Foundation Gala. I thought perhaps you'd been kidnapped. I've been busy." "So I see." Her gaze swept over his work clothes, jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, with obvious disapproval. "Playing handyman suits you surprisingly well, though I can't imagine it's particularly profitable." Before Douglas could respond, the front door opened and Libby emerged, carrying Zion on her hip. She was dressed for work in scrubs, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, but she still took Douglas's breath away. Vivienne's expression, however, suggested she was seeing something far less appealing. "You must be Elizabeth," Vivienne said, her voice carrying the kind of cultured politeness that was more cutting than outright rudeness. "Libby," she corrected quietly, unconsciously pulling Zion closer. "Of course, and this charming child must be your son." Something in Vivienne's tone made it clear she viewed Zion as a complication rather than a person. Douglas felt anger flare in his chest and stepped closer to Libby in an unconsciously protective gesture. "Mother, what are you doing here?" "Saving you from yourself, apparently." Vivian's smile was sharp as glass. "I've spoken with Stefan Lange. He's very concerned about your sudden disappearance and the rumors that you're considering relocating your practice to the Caribbean. Surely you realize how damaging this could be to your reputation." "My reputation will survive." "Will it?" "You're 32 years old, Douglas, at the peak of your career. This is not the time for a midlife crisis." "This isn't a midlife crisis, it's a vacation romance," Vivienne finished smoothly. "I understand the appeal, darling. Tropical settings can be quite intoxicating, but surely you don't intend to throw away everything you've built for a childhood infatuation." The words hit their mark. Libby's face flushed with humiliation, and she took a step back from Douglas. "I need to get to work," she said quietly. "Let me drive you," Douglas offered, desperate to escape his mother's poisonous presence. "That's not necessary. Elena's picking me up." As if summoned, Elena's car pulled into the driveway behind Vivienne's rental. Libby kissed Zion's forehead and handed him to Douglas. "Abuela's inside. I'll see you later." She hurried away without meeting his eyes, leaving Douglas holding Zion and facing his mother's triumphant smile. "Lovely girl," Vivienne said with false sweetness, "though I do hope you're being careful. Single mothers can be quite determined when they sense opportunity." "Mother?" Douglas's voice carried a warning that made even Vivienne pause. "I'm simply looking out for your interests, darling. You worked so hard to build your reputation. I won't watch you throw it away for—" She paused, glancing toward the house where Libby had disappeared. "For whatever this is." "This is love, Mother, the kind you and Father never quite understood." Vivienne's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been regret. "Perhaps that's true, but love doesn't pay for security, Douglas." As the conversation continued for over an hour, Vivienne fell silent when she noticed Douglas through the restaurant window. He was kneeling on the sidewalk, patiently helping a local child who had dropped his ice cream, using his expensive pocket square to clean the boy's tears. The child's mother was beaming, and other passers-by had stopped to smile at the gentle interaction. This wasn't the driven, ambitious son she knew. This was a man who had found something that made him genuinely kind. "He's different here," she said quietly, almost to herself. "That's what we're trying to tell you," Libby replied softly. "Your son has found himself in Barbados. He's become the man he was always meant to be." "This is more your usual standard," Vivienne observed, gesturing around the opulent dining room. "Surely you can see the difference between this and that rustic little house. That rustic little house has more warmth than my Manhattan penthouse." Warmth doesn't pay for private schools or secure financial futures, Douglas. What happens when the novelty wears off? When you remember why you left the first time? The question hit harder than Douglas wanted to admit. Over lobster and champagne he didn't want, Vivienne painted a picture of the life he was throwing away, the international projects, the prestigious awards, the respect of his peers. She spoke of practical matters, the challenges of raising another man's child, the cultural differences that would inevitably cause friction, the professional suicide of leaving New York for a small Caribbean island. "I love her," Douglas said finally. "You loved her when you were 21, too. Love isn't enough, darling. It never has been." Meanwhile, across the island, Libby was facing her own family intervention. Sebastian's parents, Carlos and Maria Morales, had arrived on the morning flight from Trinidad, ostensibly for their regular monthly visit to see Zion. But Elena had called them after witnessing the obvious chemistry between Libby and Douglas, and their concerned faces made it clear they had a unified family agenda. "We're worried about you, mija," Maria said gently, while Elena nodded in agreement from the kitchen doorway. Even family allies had their limits. "Elena called us about this man, this Douglas." "There's nothing to worry about," Libby replied, not meeting her mother-in-law's eyes. "Isn't there?" Carlos joined the conversation, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Our son has been gone only 6 months, Libby. 6 months. Don't you think it's too soon to be involved with someone new?" "I'm not involved with anyone." "No?" Maria's voice was skeptical. "Elena says he's been here every day, that he's helping with the house, spending time with Zion." "That's not nothing, mija." Libby set down Zion's plate with more force than necessary. "Douglas is a friend who's helping with some repairs. That's all." "A friend who broke your heart years ago," Carlos pointed out. "Sebastian told us about him, about your history. Do you really think it's wise to let this man back into your life when you're vulnerable?" "I'm not vulnerable. I'm fine." "Are you?" Maria's voice was gentle but probing. "Because from where we sit, it looks like you're still grieving, still struggling. And now there's this complication. We just want what's best for you and for Zion. What's best for us is for me to make my own decisions, even when those decisions might hurt our grandson." Carlos's tone sharpened. Sebastian was Zion's father in every way that mattered. The boy doesn't need confusion about loyalty, about family. He needs stability. The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Zion had been calling Douglas Dougie more frequently, reaching for him when he was upset, looking for him when he wasn't there. Was she being unfair to her son, letting him get attached to someone who might leave again? "You think I don't know what's best for my own son?" "We think grief makes people make choices they wouldn't normally make," Maria said carefully. "We think you're lonely, and this man is offering comfort that feels familiar. But what happens when he gets bored and goes back to his real life? What happens to Zion then?" The conversation continued for over an hour, Carlos and Maria tag-teaming with the skill of parents who'd raised 5 children and grandparents who'd seen their share of heartbreak. They spoke of Sebastian's memory, of Zion's need for consistency, of the practical challenges of getting involved with someone from such a different world. "We love you, mija," Maria said finally, pulling Libby into a tight embrace. "We're not saying this to hurt you. We're saying it because we've watched too many people make decisions from grief that they regret later. Sebastian would want you to be happy, but he'd also want you to be sure." By the time Douglas returned from his lunch with Vivian, both he and Libby were emotionally wrung out. They found each other on the beach behind the house, where they'd almost kissed days earlier, both seeking the peace that the rhythm of waves usually provided. "How was your lunch?" Libby asked without looking at him. "Educational. Yours?" "The same." She wrapped her arms around her knees, staring out at the horizon. "They're not wrong, you know. Your mother, Sebastian's parents. We are from different worlds. Since when do you care about different worlds? Since I became responsible for more than just myself." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have Zion to think about now, and Abuela. I can't just follow my heart and hope everything works out. What if it does work out? What if it doesn't? What if you wake up in 6 months and realize this was just nostalgia and guilt? What if the reality of small-town island life gets boring compared to your international career? What if... What if you stop thinking about all the ways this could go wrong and consider that it might go right?" But Libby was already shaking her head. "I can't take that risk. Not again. I survived losing you once, but barely. I survived losing Sebastian because I had to, for Zion. But I can't survive losing you again, and I definitely can't put Zion through that." Douglas felt the conversation slipping away from him, felt the walls going back up between them just when he thought they were finally coming down. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe we should be realistic about what this is. A nice interlude, a chance to get closure, but not a future." The words hit him like physical blows, but underneath the pain, Douglas felt a familiar stirring of the same determination that had built his career. "I don't accept that," he said quietly. "You don't get a choice in this, Douglas. This is my life, my son, my decision." "No," he stood up, brushing sand from his clothes. "This is our life. This thing between us, it's ours. And I'm not giving up on it just because other people think it's inconvenient." As he walked away, leaving Libby alone on the beach with the sound of waves and her own doubts, Douglas realized that winning her back was going to require more than words and good intentions. It was going to require proving that he was the man she needed him to be, not just the boy who had once broken her heart. Chapter 7. The Heart Wants What It Wants. For 3 days after the family confrontations, Douglas and Libby danced around each other like polite strangers. He continued his work on the house, but only when she was at the clinic. She accepted his help with Zion, but avoided being alone with him. The easy intimacy they'd built was replaced by careful courtesy that fooled no one, least of all Abuela Esperanza. "You're both being ridiculous," the elderly woman announced on Wednesday evening, after watching them navigate around each other during dinner like they were afraid of accidental contact. "All this tiptoeing around because other people have opinions about your lives." "Abuela," Libby warned. "Don't abuela me, niña. I've been watching love stories for 78 years, and I know the difference between doubt and fear. You're not doubting your feelings for this man. You're afraid of them." Douglas looked up from where he was building block towers with Zion on the living room floor. Maybe everyone else has a point. Maybe this is just nostalgia. Nostalgia doesn't make a successful architect spend 2 weeks repairing an old woman's house for free, Abuela Esperanza replied tartly. Nostalgia doesn't make a grown man read the same picture book 17 times because a toddler likes it. And nostalgia certainly doesn't make a woman look at a man the way my granddaughter looks at you when she thinks no one's watching. Both Douglas and Libby flushed, caught. "The heart wants what it wants," Abuela Esperanza continued, settling into her favorite chair with her evening tea. "The question is whether you're brave enough to listen to it or whether you're going to let other people's fears become your own." That night, after Zion was asleep and Abuela Esperanza had retired to her room, Douglas found Libby on the beach behind the house. She was sitting in the sand, knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the moonlit water. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her but careful to maintain distance. "Too much thinking." She glanced at him sideways. "Your mother left this morning." "Back to New York to report on my temporary insanity." Douglas picked up a handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. What about Sebastian's parents? Flying back to Trinidad tomorrow, they're concerned, but they trust me to make good decisions for Zion. Do you? The question hung between them like a challenge. Libby was quiet for so long that Douglas thought she might not answer, but finally she said, I used to. Before Sebastian got sick, I felt confident about everything. My career, my family, my choices. But watching someone you love die slowly, it changes you, makes you question whether anything is really in your control. Some things are they? You controlled your choice to leave 8 years ago. I controlled my choice to let you go without fighting for us. But did either of us control falling in love in the first place? Do we control feeling this way again now? Douglas turned to face her fully. Would you want to? Control it, I mean. Every day, she admitted quietly. It would be so much easier if I could just turn off whatever this is between us. But I can't, and it terrifies me. Why? Because last time I let myself believe in us, in forever, you left. And I know you had reasons, good reasons, but it nearly destroyed me. And now there's Zion to think about, and Abuela, and I can't afford to be destroyed again. The raw honesty in her voice broke something open in Douglas's chest. He reached for her hand, relief flooding through him when she didn't pull away. I can't promise I won't hurt you again, he said carefully. No one can promise that. But I can promise I won't leave, not like before, not without fighting for us first. How can you promise that? Your whole life is in New York, your business, your reputation, everything you've built. Buildings and reputation don't keep you warm at night, Douglas said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. They don't laugh at your terrible jokes or make you want to be a better person. They don't make you realize that success without someone to share it with is just expensive loneliness. Libby's breath caught. Douglas, I love you, he said simply. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you hum when you cook. I love how patient you are with Zion and how fierce you are when you're protecting your family. I love that you've built a life here that matters, that helps people, that's real in a way mine never has been. But your career? We'll adapt. Architecture exists everywhere, Libby. Good design is needed everywhere. Maybe it's time I stopped chasing prestige and started building something that actually matters. Before she could respond, he leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of 8 years' worth of longing. This time she didn't pull away. Instead, she melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with all the passion they'd both been suppressing. This is crazy, she whispered against his lips, part of her still feeling guilty for finding happiness so soon after losing Sebastian. I feel like I'm betraying his memory. Sebastian loved you. He'd want you to be happy, Douglas said gently. But we can take this as slowly as you need. There's no rush. Everyone thinks we're making a mistake. Everyone's not in love with you. I am, and I'm willing to wait as long as it takes for you to feel ready. The simple declaration undid her last defenses. I love you too, she admitted, the words tumbling out like a confession. I never stopped, even when I tried to, even when I married Sebastian. I loved him differently, but I never stopped loving you. They were walking back to the house, hand in hand and hearts full of possibility, when Douglas's phone rang. The kiss they'd shared on the beach had been tender, full of promise, but they both understood that taking things slowly was important for Libby's healing process and for Zion's adjustment to their changing family dynamic. I want to stay, Douglas said, his fingers intertwined with hers as they walked, not just for a few more weeks, permanently. I want to build a practice here, design sustainable buildings for the Caribbean. I want to wake up next to you every morning and help Zion learn to swim and argue with Abuela Esperanza about the best way to fix that stubborn kitchen faucet. Libby stopped walking to look at him. What about your clients? Your reputation. Some clients will follow good work wherever it is. Others won't, and that's fine. As for reputation, Douglas shrugged. I'd rather be known for designing buildings that improve people's lives than for being another architect who only works for the wealthy. It won't be easy. Island life is different from what you're used to. Good. I'm tired of easy. I want meaningful. They were walking back to the house, hand in hand and hearts full of possibility, when Douglas's phone rang. He almost ignored it, but the caller ID made him pause. It's Stefan Lange, he told Libby. I should take this. The conversation was brief but brutal. Stefan Lange's voice was cold with fury as he delivered his ultimatum. Return to New York immediately to close the Singapore deal, or lose the biggest contract of Douglas's career. I invested 5 years building your reputation, Douglas. I brought you into my firm when you were nobody. I made you my protege, my chosen successor. I won't watch you throw it all away for some midlife crisis in paradise. You have 24 hours to decide, Stefan Lang said before hanging up. Choose wisely. Douglas stared at his phone for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. This was the choice he'd avoided 8 years ago, the same choice that had torn them apart the first time. Career or love, ambition or happiness, the safe path or the unknown. What did he say? Libby asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. Singapore project, multi-billion-dollar development. If I don't fly to New York tomorrow, I lose the contract and probably my relationship with his firm. And if you do go? Douglas looked at her, standing in the moonlight, beautiful and brave and everything he'd ever wanted, and realized the answer was simpler than he'd expected. If I go, I lose something much more important. Douglas, you have to think about this rationally. This is your career we're talking about. Your future. No, he said, pulling her into his arms. This is my future. You and Zion and whatever life we build together. Everything else is just work. But what if? He silenced her with a kiss, pouring all his certainty into the connection between them. I choose you, he said against her lips. I choose us. This time, I choose love. As they stood there holding each other under the Caribbean stars, both of them knew that tomorrow would bring consequences. There would be difficult conversations and professional fallout, and the challenge of building something new from the ashes of Douglas's old life. But tonight, they had each other. Tonight, they had hope. And sometimes that was enough to build a future on. Chapter 8. Choosing Love. Douglas woke before dawn, Libby warm and soft beside him in her childhood bed. They'd slipped into the house quietly after their night on the beach, and she'd wordlessly led him to her room, neither wanting to spend the night apart. Now, watching her sleep in the pale morning light, he felt a certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with his heart. His phone sat on the nightstand like an accusation, no doubt full of messages from Stefan Lang, from his business partner Sarah, from clients who'd heard rumors about his extended Caribbean vacation. 24 hours to choose, Stefan Lang had said, but Douglas had already chosen. You're thinking too loud, Libby murmured against his chest, her voice thick with sleep. Sorry. Go back to sleep. Can't. Too much happening in that architect brain of yours. She propped herself up on her elbow, her hair falling around her shoulders like a dark curtain. Having second thoughts. About you. Never. Douglas tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. About turning my entire life upside down. Maybe a little. It's not too late to change your mind. You could fly to New York today, close your deal. And lose you again? Not happening. Douglas sat up, reaching for his phone. Actually, there's something I need to do. Before he could lose his nerve, he dialed Stefan Lange's number. It was still early in New York, but Stefan Lange answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with impatience. Have you come to your senses? Completely, Douglas said, and felt Libby tense beside him. I'm withdrawing from the Singapore project. The silence on the other end was deafening. When Stefan Lange finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. You're making the biggest mistake of your career. No, I made that mistake 8 years ago when I chose career over the woman I love. I'm not making it again. This will ruin you in the industry. I'll make sure of it. Then I'll build a new industry. Thank you for everything you've taught me, Stefan Lange, but I choose love. Douglas hung up before Stefan Lange could respond, then immediately turned off his phone. The bridges were burned now. There was no going back. You just walked away from millions of dollars, Libby said quietly. I walked towards something worth more than money. Douglas pulled her into his arms. I walked toward home. The next few hours passed in a blur of difficult phone calls. Douglas spent the morning on the veranda, methodically working through his contact list, informing clients of his decision to relocate his practice to Barbados. Some were angry, others understanding, but most were skeptical about following his work to the Caribbean. He lost 3 major contracts that morning alone, representing millions in potential revenue. Sarah, his business partner, was devastated. You're throwing away everything we've built together, she said, her voice tight with emotion that seemed about more than just business. What about your apartment, your furniture, your life? I'm arranging for everything to be sold or shipped, Douglas replied gently. The New York office will be yours. You've earned it. And Sarah, there's something else. I think you should know that what you're feeling, it's not just about the business, is it? A long pause. Does it matter now? It matters because you deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve. That person isn't me, but he's out there. By afternoon, Douglas had a plan. He'd spent years building a reputation for innovative, sustainable design. That reputation could travel. He would start small, taking on local projects that needed an architect's touch, renovations, small commercial buildings, maybe eventually larger developments that honored Caribbean culture instead of overwhelming it. There's something else I need to do, he told Libby as she prepared to leave for her evening shift at the clinic. Something important. What? You'll see. Trust me. Libby studied his face, noting the nervous energy beneath his calm exterior. Always. Douglas arrived at the clinic an hour before Libby's shift ended, carrying a carefully wrapped package and wearing his best shirt. The community health center was exactly what he'd expected, small, understaffed, and serving a population that couldn't afford private health care. But it was clean and well organized, and the staff clearly cared deeply about their patients. You must be Douglas, said Dr. Patricia Williams, the clinic director, when he introduced himself. Libby talks about you constantly. Good things, I hope. Mostly. Dr. Williams's smile was knowing. She also mentioned you're an architect. We've been needing someone to look at our expansion plans, if you're interested in pro bono work. Very interested, Douglas replied, meaning it. This was exactly the kind of project he wanted to focus on, meaningful work that improved people's lives. Libby's with a patient, but she should be finished soon. Why don't you wait in the break room? The break room was small and cheerful, with mismatched furniture and children's drawings taped to the walls. Douglas sat down to wait, his package in his lap, rehearsing words he'd been composing all day. Douglas. Libby appeared in the doorway, still wearing scrubs, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. What are you doing here? Is everything okay? Is Zion? Everyone's fine, he said quickly, standing up. I needed to talk to you, about us, about our future. Here, now? Libby glanced around the break room. Douglas, I'm at work. I know, but this couldn't wait. Douglas took a deep breath, every speech he'd prepared suddenly forgotten. I love you, Libby. I love who you are, what you've built here, the life you've created for Zion and Abuela Esperanza. I love that you dedicate your life to taking care of people, that you see beauty in simple things, that you make me want to be better than I am. Douglas. Libby's voice was soft, uncertain. I burned the bridges today, all of them. I told Stephen Lang to take his Singapore project and find another architect. I told my business partner she could have the New York office. I told everyone who'd listen that I'm relocating permanently to Barbados to build a practice that matters. Libby's eyes widened. You did what? I chose you, I chose us, and now I'm asking you to choose us too. Douglas dropped to one knee right there in the clinic break room, pulling a small velvet box from his package. Marry me, Libby, not because it's practical or convenient or what other people expect, but because I can't imagine a life without you and Zion in it. Because I want to wake up next to you every morning and argue with you about home renovations and watch Zion grow up and maybe have more children together and grow old on that beach where we fell in love again. The ring he'd chosen was perfect. A simple solitaire set with small Caribbean blue stones that reminded him of the sea. It wasn't the biggest or most expensive ring he could have afforded, but it was beautiful and unique, just like their love story. Douglas, Libby breathed, tears streaming down her face. I know it's scary. I know we're taking a huge risk, but 8 years ago I let fear make my choices for me, and I've regretted it every day since. This time I want love to make the choice. Will you marry me? Before Libby could answer, the break room door burst open, and Zion toddled in, Elena close behind with an apologetic expression. Sorry, he got away from me when he saw Mama, Elena explained, then stopped short when she saw Douglas on one knee. Oh, I'll just... But Zion had spotted Douglas and made a beeline for him, arms outstretched. Dougie, up! Douglas laughed, tears in his own eyes now, and scooped the toddler into his arms. Hey, buddy, want to help me ask Mama an important question? Zion looked between Douglas and Libby with serious 18-month-old contemplation, then clapped his hands together. Mama happy? Yes, she is, Douglas agreed, looking at Libby's radiant face. What do you say, Mama? Will you marry us? Yes, Libby whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. Yes! Of course, yes. The ring slipped onto her finger like it had been waiting 8 years to find its home. Douglas stood, still holding Zion, and kissed his fiancée deeply, while their son giggled and clapped between them. We're getting married, Libby announced to Elena, who immediately started crying and shouting for the rest of the clinic staff. Within minutes, the break room was full of nurses and doctors and a few patients who'd heard the commotion. Dr. Williams beamed with approval. She'd grown fond of Douglas during his clinic renovation project. Some nurses offered immediate congratulations, while others seemed more reserved. Mrs. Patterson from the guest house pushed through the small crowd, tears in her eyes. I knew it, she exclaimed. From the first week he moved in, talking about that beautiful nurse with the sweet baby. I told my sister, that man is smitten. The mix of enthusiasm and cautious acceptance felt authentically Bajan. Island communities embraced love stories, but they also protected their own. This is going to be the most talked-about engagement in Barbados history, Elena predicted, hugging them both. Good, Douglas said, pulling Libby and Zion closer. Let everyone know I'm the luckiest man on the island. As the celebration continued around them, Douglas marveled at how right this felt. Not the polished perfection of his New York life, but the messy, joyful reality of love and family and choosing to build something meaningful together. He'd thought success meant building the tallest buildings and earning the biggest fees. But holding his future wife and son, while surrounded by people whose lives were dedicated to caring for others, Douglas realized he'd finally learned what success actually looked like. It looked like coming home. Chapter 9. Building Dreams. 6 months after Douglas's proposal, Barbados felt like home in a way New York never had. He woke each morning to rustling palm trees and Zion's delighted laughter echoing from the kitchen where Libby prepared breakfast. The simple rhythm of island life had settled into his bones, replacing Manhattan's frenetic energy with something deeper and more sustainable. Daddy Doug, Daddy Doug. Zion's voice carried through the house, followed by the patter of small feet running toward the bedroom. At 2 years old now, he was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, his vocabulary expanding daily and his attachment to Douglas absolute. "I'm coming, buddy," Douglas called, pulling on shorts and a t-shirt. Gone were the expensive suits and Italian leather shoes. Island life called for simpler clothing and a more relaxed approach to everything. He found Zion in the kitchen, standing on his special step stool while Libby helped him crack eggs into a bowl. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the house that was now truly theirs. Douglas had bought it from Abuela Esperanza's landlord and put it in all their names, ensuring the family would never have to worry about housing again. "We're making pancakes," Libby announced, flour dusting her pajamas and her hair escaping from its ponytail. She was more beautiful now than she'd been 8 years ago, happiness adding a glow that no amount of makeup could replicate. "Pancakes for Daddy," Zion added seriously, continuing to stir with intense concentration. The word Daddy still made Douglas's heart skip. The adoption papers had been finalized 3 months ago, with Sebastian's parents' full blessing. Carlos and Maria had visited twice since the engagement, and while their initial reservations had been understandable, they'd quickly seen how devoted Douglas was to Zion and how happy their daughter-in-law had become. "Carlos pulled me aside during their last visit," Libby had told Douglas one evening as they worked in the garden together. "He said Sebastian would have approved of you, that he would have wanted Zion to have a father who loved him as much as you do." The conversation had meant more to Douglas than any architectural award ever had. "Morning, everyone." Abuela Esperanza appeared in the kitchen doorway, moving more slowly than she used to, but still sharp as ever. At 79, she'd officially handed over most household management to Libby and Douglas, though she maintained firm control over the garden and continued to offer unsolicited advice about everything from child-rearing to wedding planning. "Buenos dias, bisabuela," Zion chirped, holding up his eggy spoon for her inspection. "Muy bien, mi amor," she approved, kissing his forehead before settling at the kitchen table where Douglas had laid out the morning newspapers and her tea. This was their routine now, breakfast together as a family, Zion helping with cooking while the adults discussed the day's plans. It was domestic and ordinary and absolutely perfect. Douglas's architectural practice was slowly building from scratch. His New York reputation meant little here. He had to prove himself with local materials, island weather challenges, and community needs he was still learning. The first few small projects had been more about establishing trust than profit. "Speaking of the practice," Douglas said, pouring coffee for himself and Libby, "I got a call yesterday from the Ministry of Tourism. They want to discuss the Sustainable Resort Project." "The one on the East Coast?" Libby asked, settling Zion in his high chair with a plate of perfectly round pancakes. "That's the one. 20-room boutique hotel using solar power and rainwater collection, built into the hillside to minimize environmental impact. It would be the biggest project I've taken on here." Douglas had spent weeks learning about hurricane-resistant construction, traditional Bajan architectural elements, and local building materials. "Mrs. Patterson's nephew is a master carpenter. He's been teaching me about working with local mahogany and coral stone." And it would establish you as the premier sustainable architect in the Caribbean, Abuela Esperanza added shrewdly. Which was always your goal, wasn't it? Douglas smiled. Very little escaped the elderly woman's attention. It would certainly help build the kind of practice I want to have. Daddy work, Zion announced, pointing toward the window where Douglas's drafting table was visible in the converted bedroom that had become his home office. That's right. I work from home so I can have breakfast with you every morning, Douglas said, ruffling the boy's curls. It was a far cry from the glass towers and international travel of his previous life, but Douglas had never been happier. Working from home meant he could walk Zion to the beach while Libby was at the clinic, could help with afternoon naps and bedtime stories, could be present for all the small moments that made up a child's life. The wedding dress fitting is this afternoon, Libby mentioned, consulting the calendar on the refrigerator that had become command central for their lives. Elena's picking up Mama and the girls at 2. Their wedding was planned for the following month, a sunset ceremony on the beach behind the house, with a reception in the garden. It would be small, family and close friends, but perfect for them. Libby was wearing Abuela Esperanza's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her perfectly, while Douglas would wear a traditional guayabera that Sebastian's father had helped him choose during their last visit. And I have the final meeting with Father Rodriguez about the ceremony, Douglas added. The priest had been initially skeptical about marrying a couple with such a complicated history, but he'd been won over by their obvious devotion to each other and to Zion. What about the family celebration? Abuela Esperanza asked. They'd planned a small party for the following weekend to officially announce Douglas's intention to adopt Zion and celebrate their engagement to the community. Elena's handling the cake. You're in charge of decorations and I'm supposed to stay out of the way while you all plan, Douglas recited dutifully. Smart man, Libby laughed, leaning over to kiss his cheek. The morning continued with their usual blend of family time and individual responsibilities. Douglas spent an hour reviewing architectural plans while Zion napped, then joined Libby in the garden where they were expanding the vegetable plot. Working with his hands in the soil while she told him about her patients was exactly the kind of life he'd never known he wanted. Mrs. Peterson's diabetes is finally under control, Libby said, tying tomato plants to their stakes. And the Williams baby took his first steps yesterday. How's the expansion project going? Douglas asked. The clinic was adding a pediatric wing, designed by Douglas and funded partially by a grant he'd helped them write. Construction should start next month. The board is thrilled with your designs. They say it's exactly what the community needs. The island community had been initially wary of another foreign architect, but Douglas's respectful approach and commitment to local workers and materials had gradually earned their trust. Instead of designing luxury towers for the wealthy, he was creating spaces that served families like his own. "Daddy! Daddy!" Zion's voice called from the house, signaling the end of his nap. "I'll get him," Douglas said, but Libby caught his hand. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you?" she asked softly. "Only every day, but I don't mind hearing it again. I love you, Douglas Gary. I love the man you've become, the father you are to Zion, the life we're building together. Even though I gave up millions of dollars and international fame to play in the dirt with you. Especially because of that." Libby stood on her tiptoes to kiss him properly. "You chose us. You chose this. And every day I fall in love with you a little bit more." They were interrupted by Zion calling again, this time with more urgency, and Douglas hurried inside to find his son standing in his crib with his arms outstretched. "Daddy, up!" Douglas lifted him easily, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and afternoon sleep. "Did you have a good nap, buddy?" "Swim," Zion announced seriously. "Beach?" "Tomorrow," Douglas promised. "We'll go to the beach tomorrow and practice swimming. The transition hadn't been easy financially. Douglas was living off his savings while building the new practice, taking on smaller projects than he was used to. But watching Zion's first steps on the beach, where he and Libby had found each other again, made every sacrifice worthwhile. It was smaller than his old life, more contained, focused on a single island instead of spanning continents. But it was also deeper, richer, filled with meaning in a way that international acclaim had never provided. As evening approached and they sat on the veranda watching the sunset, Zion drowsy in his lap and Libby's hand in his, Douglas marveled at the journey that had brought him here. 8 years ago, he'd thought success meant building the tallest buildings and earning the most money. Now he knew that success meant this, being exactly where you belonged, with the people who mattered most, building something that would last. Chapter 10. Forever. This time, the morning of their wedding dawned with perfect Caribbean beauty that seemed designed by nature for celebrations. The sky was a canvas of soft pastels, gentle ocean breezes carried the scent of frangipani and jasmine, and the sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon in shades of turquoise and sapphire that no artist could replicate. Douglas stood on the beach behind their house, watching the sunrise paint the world in gold and rose while the wedding preparations began around him. Elena and her daughters were stringing lights between the palm trees, creating a magical canopy for the evening ceremony. The local steel drum band was setting up their instruments near the water's edge, and the catering team from the village was arranging tables in the garden under Abuela Esperanza's watchful supervision. "Nervous?" asked Father Rodriguez, joining Douglas at the water's edge. The priest had arrived early to help with the setup and to offer any last-minute counseling the couple might need. "Excited," Douglas corrected, surprising himself with how calm he felt. "I've been waiting 8 years for this day, Father. I'm ready." "Good. That's how a groom should feel." Father Rodriguez smiled, adjusting his white collar in the humid morning air. "Your bride, however, might be feeling differently." As if summoned by his words, Libby's voice carried from the house, elevated with what could charitably be called pre-wedding stress. "The flowers are wilting. Elena, we need more ice for the arrangements. And where is Zion? He can't get his good clothes dirty before the ceremony." Douglas grinned. His bride-to-be was definitely feeling the pressure of coordinating a wedding while trying to keep a 2-year-old clean and entertained. "I should go rescue her," he said, but Father Rodriguez caught his arm. "Bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony." "That's a superstition. Humor an old priest. Besides, Abuela Esperanza has everything under control." Indeed, even from the beach, Douglas could see the elderly woman directing operations with military precision. At 80 years old, she moved with purpose and authority that had everyone jumping to follow her orders. The day passed in a blur of activity. Douglas spent the morning with Carlos and Maria Morales, who had arrived from Trinidad the day before, along with his own parents. Vivienne Gary had surprised everyone by not only attending the wedding, but actually seeming to enjoy herself. Her initial horror at the rustic accommodations had given way to genuine appreciation for the warmth of island hospitality. "You look happy, son," his father had said the previous evening over dinner. "Really happy, in a way I don't think I've seen since you were a child." The admission had meant more to Douglas than years of professional approval ever had. Now, as afternoon melted into early evening, Douglas stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the house, adjusting his guayabera one final time. The traditional white shirt, with its intricate embroidery and flowing lines, felt infinitely more appropriate for a beach wedding than any tuxedo would have. "Daddy!" Zion burst into the bathroom, followed by Elena's husband Miguel, who was serving as unofficial wrangler for the ring-bearer. "Sorry," Miguel said breathlessly. "He escaped while we were getting him dressed." Douglas looked down at his son. The thought still made his heart swell. who was wearing a miniature version of Douglas's outfit, complete with tiny white pants and a small white guayabera. His dark curls were neatly combed, and he carried the ring pillow with serious two-year-old importance. "You look very handsome, buddy," Douglas said, kneeling to straighten Zion's collar. "Daddy handsome too," Zion announced, then leaned in close to whisper conspiratorially, "Mama, pretty dress." "Is she wearing her pretty dress?" Zion nodded vigorously. "Very pretty, like princess." "Well then, we better go marry our princess, don't you think?" As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, guests gathered on the beach. The guest list was small but perfect. Elena and her family, Libby's colleagues from the clinic, Douglas's new friends from the architectural community, neighbors who had become like family, and the Morales family representing Sebastian's memory with love and blessing. Vivienne Gary sat in the front row wearing an elegant but island-appropriate dress. The past months had been a journey for her. She'd extended her Barbados stay twice, ostensibly to oversee Douglas's situation, but really to understand what had captured her son so completely. She'd watched him work alongside local carpenters, seen him laugh with genuine joy while teaching Zion to identify birds, witnessed his patient care of Abuela Esperanza when the elderly woman caught a cold. The Douglas she knew was accomplished but restless. This Douglas was accomplished and content. Beside her, Abuela Esperanza held court in her best Sunday dress, accepting compliments on the decorations and the garden with regal grace. Father Rodriguez took his place near the water's edge as the steel drum band began playing the opening notes of a traditional Caribbean wedding song. The melody was joyful and romantic, carrying across the water like a blessing. Douglas took his position next to the priest, his heart racing with anticipation. 8 years ago, he'd stood at an altar in a New York chapel, waiting for a bride who never came because he'd broken her heart 3 weeks before their wedding. Today felt like redemption, like the universe offering him a second chance to do everything right. Miguel appeared at the back of the aisle, the sandy path between the palm trees that led from the house to the water, carrying Zion, who clutched his ring pillow and waved enthusiastically at the guests. "Remember, walk slowly," Miguel whispered, setting Zion down at the beginning of the aisle. Zion nodded seriously, then promptly began running toward Douglas, his little legs churning in the sand while the guests laughed and applauded. He reached his father and threw himself into Douglas's arms, ring pillow and all. "Good job, buddy," Douglas whispered, accepting the rings and passing Zion to Abuela Esperanza in the front row. The music shifted then, becoming something softer and more romantic, and Douglas's breath caught as Libby appeared at the end of the aisle. She was radiant. Abuela Esperanza's wedding dress had been transformed by careful alterations into something that seemed designed specifically for Libby. The vintage lace and flowing silk moved like water in the ocean breeze, and the cathedral-length veil that had been shortened to fingertip length framed her face like a dream. Her hair was swept up in a loose chignon adorned with tiny white flowers from the garden, and she carried a bouquet of local blooms, hibiscus, bird of paradise, and jasmine that seemed to glow in the golden light. But it was her face that took Douglas's breath away. She was smiling through happy tears, her eyes locked on his as she walked slowly down the sandy aisle. This wasn't the nervous young woman he'd almost married 8 years ago. This was a mature woman who had lived and loved and lost and found her way back to happiness. She was choosing him with full knowledge of what love could cost and what it was worth. Elena walked beside her as matron of honor, but Douglas barely saw anyone except Libby. She seemed to float toward him, and when she reached his side and took his hands, the rest of the world faded away. "You're beautiful," he whispered, and she squeezed his hands in response. "Dearly beloved," Father Rodriguez began, his voice carrying easily over the soft sound of waves. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Douglas and Elizabeth, two souls who have found their way back to each other after a long journey. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, blending Catholic traditions with Caribbean customs and personal touches that reflected their unique story. When they exchanged vows, both spoke from the heart about second chances, about choosing love over fear, about building a family while honoring the past. "I promise to never let pride or fear come between us again," Douglas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "I promise to choose you every day and to earn the privilege of being Zion's father." "I promise to trust in our love," Libby replied, tears streaming down her face. "I promise to believe in forever, even when it seems impossible. I promise to build our dreams together, one day at a time." When Father Rodriguez pronounced them husband and wife, the beach erupted in cheers and applause. Douglas kissed his bride as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, while steel drums played and their family celebrated around them. "We did it," Libby whispered against his lips. "We did it," he agreed, spinning her around while her veil floated in the ocean breeze. The reception was everything they'd dreamed. Dinner under the stars, dancing on the sand, toasts that mixed laughter and tears, and Zion charming every guest by insisting on dancing with all the ladies. As the evening wound down and guests began to drift away, Douglas and Libby found themselves alone on the beach where they'd fallen in love again. Zion was asleep in Abuela Esperanza's arms, and the house glowed with warm light behind them. "Mrs. Gary," Douglas said, pulling his wife close. "I like the sound of that," she replied, then suddenly looked nervous. "Douglas, there's something I need to tell you. Something I found out yesterday." "What is it?" She took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach, her eyes bright with joy and anticipation. "We're going to have a baby." Douglas felt the world tilt on its axis. "A baby? Really? Really? I wanted to tell you before the wedding, but I was afraid it might be too much. Are you happy?" Happy seemed like an inadequate word for what he was feeling. Ecstatic, overwhelmed, grateful. He kissed her deeply, tasting salt air and happiness on her lips. "How far along?" 6 weeks. The baby should arrive next spring." Douglas placed his forehead against hers, marveling at how complete his life had become. 8 years ago, he'd walked away from this woman because he'd thought success meant money and recognition. Now, standing on a Caribbean beach with his wife and sleeping son while she carried their child, he understood that success meant this: being exactly where you belonged, with the people who mattered most. "I love you, Mrs. Gary," he whispered. "Forever this time?" she asked, echoing the question that had haunted them both. "Forever this time," he promised, sealing it with a kiss under the Caribbean stars. In the distance, Abuela Esperanza watched from the veranda, with Zion sleeping peacefully in her arms, and smiled. Some love stories were worth waiting for. Some were strong enough to survive mistakes and time and others' opinions. And some, like the one she'd just witnessed, were destined to become family legends told for generations. As Douglas and Libby danced alone where their second chance had begun, their future stretched ahead like an endless horizon, full of possibility, anchored in love, and blessed with the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, worth waiting for, worth believing in no matter how impossible they seem. Their forever had finally begun.